Good evening and welcome. So we're on week 6 of Fowler and the Garden Trust series, Why So Special? The last, and it's the last of the 4 talks on commercial landscapes. We've invited a range of fascinating speakers to focus in detail on each one of the post-war designed landscapes and gardens added to Historic England's list last year. And the objective with these talks is to raise awareness about the work, the ideas and thinking of the original designers, and also how these sites are now looking, and to see what we can learn from this and take forward, and also to find out what more about, there is in relevant archives and things, and what makes these places still so very special. We also wanted to know about these places from an alternative perspective. And so for most of the talks, we have 2 speakers, and each time it's different. And so tonight also. So in this series so far, we've looked at 2 sites to the west of London, Stockley Park with the golf course, the country park, and the new American style business park. Broadwater Park, which was a smaller scale project of offices and warehousing, which is now sort of got an uncertain future perhaps to it. Cummins Engine Factory, which is sort of incredibly understated landscape. And we learned how this fits in with Dan Kiley's body of work and with his roots in classical design. But only once he'd physically immersed himself in the Baroque gardens of Germany. I found that fascinating. So there are great parallels with our talk today on Jellicoe's project. And so on to tonight. So I'd like to introduce Ed Bennis. He was head of School of Landscape at Manchester Metropolitan University and head of the Centre for Landscape Research. He's been a landscape consultant to English heritage and regional governments and has held numerous positions on regional and national bodies, including the Green Flag Judge, CABE, Civic Trust, and Chairman and Trustee of Cheshire Gardens Trust. He's been a visiting professor in Haifa, Beijing, I can't say the next word, Guangzhou, and the University of Guangzhou, thank you, and the University of Novi Sad in Serbia. So Ed, please crack on.
Well, thank you for the introduction. And I want to thank everyone behind this in terms of Fowler for actually setting these up, because I think they're very important. And I just wasn't too sure how many people really had any sort of background on Jellicoe, but this is just a list of a few things that he was involved in some of his background and his interest. I think what's very interesting now is the number of people that were active in the new LI Council. These are just key names in the whole development of landscape architecture in the UK. And I think to a certain extent, these are the sort of heroes of the time, and really brought it into a professional realm and developed it from there. But it's interesting when you start to look at the pre-World War II period of time, 1938, in this case, the cover of Landscape and Garden, which will later become the LI in their journal. And you look at this modern house on the hill, and the stylized tree and the stylized crocus, which is certainly very reminiscent of Clarice Cliff in her pottery. So you can imagine those bright colors being added to the thing. But I thought Jellicoe, in terms of what he said in the autumn issue of the same journal, we're now at the beginning of the struggle between old and new. It's the work of the landscape architect to adjust the differences and lead the way in the creative arts. That creative art, or the mother of all arts that he often referred to as landscape architecture, well, I think it was a bit of a dream at this stage, because this is what things really look like. And here we have an article by Christopher Tunnard, who wrote the book Gardens in the Modern Landscape. And you look at the nature of the work that's going on. I think this is actually one of his own designs, a very traditional sort of arts and crafts sort of landscape. Let's face it, that's what our landscape architects could actually earn a living with, and in terms of this sort of traditional work. And the idea of modernism is sort of a long ways off. And David Jakes pointed out quite nicely about the innate conservatism of the British, that modern design was no more than a waking dream of the intellectual. It's interesting here, you have Geoffrey Jellicoe on the right and Peter Shepherd on the left at Longwood Gardens in November, December 1989. And Jellicoe's influences were very much from the sort of often abstract art, but also the group of people that he knew. And Paul Klee was introduced to him by Henry Moore in terms of his work. And so Jellicoe actually had quite a substantial modern art collection of his own, of people like Henry Moore, Ben Nicholson, Paul Klee, and Barbara Hepworth were sort of key people in this period of time to him. One of the key elements of Jellicoe's work is water. There's no doubt water played an important part through his whole sort of career and his work. And we see the Caveman restaurant on the left, top left, which we'll see again in just a second. And then we have the Moody Gardens on the right, top right, which is basically his last proposal, never built. So we have one of his earliest pieces of work and we have one of his last pieces of work. And even below in those two images at Sutton Place on the left and Hemel Hempstead on the right, water in different ways is so important in Jellicoe's sort of catalog of work. Well, I thought this is really interesting that Jellicoe and Russell Page, I don't know why my cursor's bouncing around there, worked together on the Caveman restaurant. And I thought Page was really interesting in what he put in or wrote in The Education of the Gardener. My thought is always, how little can I do rather than how much to achieve the most telling result? And that's sort of almost a slogan or a strapline for the modernist movement of the period of time. There was a certain paring down, but it doesn't mean it was sterile, that it lacked life and humanity in it. As we move on and we start to move to talk about the site I'm supposed to talk about, the Moreton factory or the Cadbury factory is at the top end of the Wirral. And across from there, you have Liverpool. And you can see the damage that was done during World War II. And in fact, the painting in the bottom right is by Sir Peter Shepherd. He was 28 years old. And the painting is about the sort of May Blitz, which took place between the 1st and 7th of May in 1941. And these are the reasons, or part of the reasons, why the Cadbury factory was located where it was. And basically, Liverpool and Birkenhead areas needed reconstruction. They were heavily bombed in the war. There was a need for new jobs, employment in the post-war period. And there was also a surplus of skilled workers in the area. So these people that had been dealing with munitions or whatever else in the region needed new jobs to do. And so Cadbury's ended up developing a new factory in just north of Birkenhead Park at Moreton. And this was the real reason why, or part of the reason why it was located here, was temperature, which seems very strange. But Cadbury's in Bourneville got too warm at certain times of the summer and they couldn't produce their chocolate biscuits. But here, being a few hundred meters from the Irish Sea, the air was cooler and Cadbury's found that they could actually produce their chocolate on a year-round basis. So there was a very sort of site-specific reason for it to exist there. The staff architect was a man called Wilkinson. Jellicoe is listed as the past president of the Landscape Institute and as the landscape consultant. And Clapham Nurseries, which appears to be a Northwestern nursery, were responsible for the land work and the construction. What we don't know is how Jellicoe got the job. We have no earthly idea. We haven't come across that information yet. But what's perhaps interesting is Jellicoe hated the site. He said it was diabolical. It was exposed. It was badly drained. There was a major drain running across the site. And so almost everything is against you. Now, as we start to look at the plan, we have the initial factory site in here, And we have a train station just off plan, which is right here next to this road. And what Jellicoe did with the location of the factory being in here, he provided an access route for those coming from the train station and from the town where your workers are coming from to the factory. And so he provided a walk with a view down at the upper level and from the train station at the lower level. And you would walk across this, and there were some seats in here. They're quite derelict now. And then you have this water feature, which runs the whole length of this entrance. The source of the water is here. And up here, you have the main entrance to the factory. And I think one of the things that always struck me from the first time we saw this was the fact that it was along the roadside. It was where the workers walked to work. It wasn't at the entrance to the site, which is quite often the normal place where you put a major expensive piece of work, or at the entrance, the main entrance to the building for your visitors and guests, not for your workers. So it was interesting where he located it, which was quite odd by sort of normal practice. And then also we have in here, we have the sort of works canteen and social club and a bit of ornamental planting. But along here as well, there were playing fields out this way. There was a bowling green and also a small pond for fishing. And we can see in here the, I'll say staff shop these days. This is when Cadbury's were getting rid of it towards the end of their day. And in the builder in 1954, it says he is responsible for this portion of the work, and his landscaping includes a series of ponds and cascades down the west side of the site. The land beyond the North Road and the canteen is to be permanently preserved for playing fields and recreation. I think what's interesting as well in this post-World War II period, this is not the sort of industrial development that we saw in the 19th century and early 20th century of Port Sunlight or Bourneville or New Earswick, where it had everything of housing, of schools, of hospitals or nurseries for children. This is purely a place of work, some level of recreation, and the odd separate house on here for the site manager. So it did not have the same sort of paternalistic approach, but it still certainly had areas and designs that he put in for the workers on this site. What Jellicoe also did, we can see these sort of cascades down here again, and the initial sites of the main sort of factories. You can also see a rail line that runs through here, and it said the rail station was here. So you had sidings to bring your raw materials in and your finished products out. Then you have sort of schematic areas of diagrams of various sort of features for the workers. And these would be eventually areas for expansion or extension of the factory. That never happened. These remained as playing fields. But as he said earlier, he really disliked this site. And the Irish Sea is just up here, a few hundred meters away. And so he developed two things. First of all, major windbreak in here and some sub breaks going through the site to divide it up. And what he did is he provided these sort of sinuous earthen mounds with planting along this area of the site and then down here. This was the soil that was dug out to actually create the footings and foundations for the factories and the social club. And on here, it was tree planting, and this was part of the break. And this is also where in studies in landscape design in 1966, he said it's to protect this dreary and exposed environment, and the geometry of the factory is extended by tree planting. Soil from the canal has been used to produce the hills and suggestive of a prehistoric animal form. Now, we always think of Jellicoe with the metaphors that start with the project, which isn't the case. The first time we come across a metaphor related to this prehistoric animal is in 1961, I think, 63, in a paper he did for the National Playing Fields Association. And then he puts it into his Landscape Design Volume 2 in 1966. So the story came, we believe, after, not during or before, which does produce some confusion. Now, the storyline, extended shape of two serpents. He referred to this as a clue in his design, and the serpent was a reference to the vast prehistoric monsters that would have emerged from the forest in this area. He used the same symbolism for the serpent at the water canal at Hemel Hempstead. Now, it's interesting how we found out about this site, and it was Annabelle Downs had a project here, a school site very close by. She got off the train and walked past the site and recognized it as this is something which is distinctive, it's professional. She thought it was probably 1930s. Of course, we find out it's about 1952 when it was actually on paper. And it was purely by accident discovering this site. And then Annabelle contacted the site manager there, and then she and I went to visit it, and we met the site manager, a very nice man, who said he was being made redundant in a few weeks. So we went out to look at the site with him. He'd been desperately trying to get the water to work or the ponds not to leak. And then we went back in for a little talk, and he said, I've got these drawings here, he said, by some man called Jellicoe. No idea who he is. But he said, you can have them if you want them. So we took the drawings, and they were then lodged with the LI in London, and then they moved on to Reading. So it's interesting that how many more sites from various people are just out there waiting to be discovered. We just don't know, do we? But I suspect there's quite a few more. In terms of the metaphor and the social response, we can see in here the large belt of trees, the furthest one, and we can see in here, these are the ones which were designed to reflect the serpent. We have a bowling green in here. And I think it's the way he sort of told the story. He built up the story, and he said the planting on the windward side of the mounds would be armor plated with tough hardwood or conifer trees, whereas the inside face, being the soft underbelly of the serpent, would be richly planted with flowering trees and shrubs. So he continued his metaphor, he continued his stories all the way through. And so we have the metaphor and mixed with the sort of social needs of the workers, and here the fishing pond. So there was a fishing club there, and there was also a horticultural club for many, many years on this site. One of the key features, I believe, in terms of Jellicoe's work here, is that it is an early introduction or his use and experimentation with perspectives. And I put Longwood back up here because I think there's something interesting when we start to look at Shepherd and Jellicoe at Longwood Gardens. And this idea of deceptions or deceit, Repton in 1791, 1792 wrote about Tatton Park, that a true artist should put a generous deceit upon the spectators and effect the noblest designs by any method. Designs that are vast only by their dimensions are always a sign of a low imagination. Repton here was trying to take two bodies of water from this viewpoint and make them look like they were one larger body of water. And that was a deception there. We also have that sort of deception, and we'll hear more about Birkenhead Park in a few minutes on the left. But if you look at the lake feature, the deception there is that it meanders around so much that no one can actually tell how large or how small it is. It seems endless. And we have the same thing in the humble administrator's garden in China, where if you look at the water on the map, it goes all over the place again. And once again, when you go in that garden, you have no idea how extensive or where the water begins or ends. It is completely confusing, but everywhere you go is a viewpoint. And so you have these constant viewpoints all the way through that landscape. Now, those deceptions, I think Jellicoe really picked up when he went on his tour and produced his book with Jock Shepherd on gardens of the Italian Renaissance. And Edith Wharton wrote in her book on Italian villas, probably the most perfect example of producing the art of producing a great effect on a small scale, breadth and simplicity of composition. The villa sits in the middle. To the right is a parterre, and to the top, to the north side, is another one. But look at this, that you have in these first ones, the distance here is shorter than these. You have the same thing here, shorter and longer. We have examples in Hyde Park in London, in the Italian gardens, about, must be close 35, even 40 years ago. I paced that off to discover that the same thing happens there. What it does, it elongates the perspective and it makes it look longer. And the same thing, in this case, it looks at a feature. In this case, it looks at the surrounding landscape, the borrowed view of the landscape. And this is at Longwood Gardens. And this is the funny one, simply because Pierre Dupont was impressed by the Villa Gambari as well. And what he did, he put in sort of a similar water feature based on the same idea, short and long, except he got it mixed up. This became the long and that became the short. So in fact, he reduced the visual length of the perspective. He shortened the whole thing by the way it was physically laid out and getting the thing in reverse. So there's a lot of things in here to learn, because Jellicoe then plays, and this is probably certainly the most notable, two things, perspective and scale. And the perspective here and this long walk, which is the Magritte walk, these urns, I regret I don't have somebody standing next to them because they are monstrous in their size and dwarf people. But the walk actually narrows and focuses on a relatively small relief bronze plaque. And then if you notice the paving, it actually physically becomes narrower as you go closer to the plaque, and then it disappears. And these two parallel lines, in fact, are not parallel. They're converging to exaggerate the one-point perspective, to make the distance look greater than it is. And Jellicoe played over here, again, with that scale. Once we see a scale like that, it does distort things. And this Ben Nicholson sculpture is enormous. You'd think it would sink into the ground, but it appears to be floating. And the space is really, we would generally consider too small for the size of sculpture, but Jellicoe plays with perspective and with scale, and this contrasting scale of the spaces. I think is a very, very clever thing. And what he did here, and I'll just reorientate you, the picture and the plan are orientated more or less in the same direction. This is the entrance to the site. This is the train station up at the top. The workers came down here along the road and in, or they came along a footpath, along that area there with seating and overlooking these ponds. What we're looking at is somewhere in here, back here, into the site, to this actual source of the water. The planting is very simple. A few trees, small trees, a little bit of shrub planting, nothing ornate, nothing overly fancy in here. And he writes that the distance in the canal can be increased or decreased by adjusting the apparently parallel lines of the perspective. He did that at Sutton Place as you go on the Magritte Walk. Size can be increased by adjusting architectural details such as handrails of bridges whose normal height is familiar. So if you reduce the height of a handrail, it looks like it's further away. Distance can be increased by eliminating boundaries or suggest mysteries behind islands. This planting in here is the mystery because it blocks the view to the source. So as you look up the canal, you wonder, where is the water coming from? It's a very, very flat landscape. And so there's very little change in level to create the effect of these cascades. But as you look up, the eye, there's only one line, one straight line, and the rest of it is this zigzag pattern that takes the eye off to the side constantly. But what anchors it are these planters in here. So you're stopped. It's like a punctuation point, a comma, as you view this landscape. But the pattern, this zigzag thing, isn't unusual. It's actually quite a well-used feature in design in the interwar period. And we have the Tachard Garden in Paris, and we can see this form in here, and again in here below it. That's the same viewpoint, looking this way, looking down here to this point here. But we also see it being used in this sort of poster by Sonia Delaunay and in the textiles, and we find this over and over again. So what was strange, it's not surprising that this was thought to be a garden or a landscape from the 1930s. These were strong elements in the pre-war period. When the war came along, everything simply stopped, but the design sort of picks up and the ideas pick up and continue on after the war. Sorry, wrong button. But we also see in the International Exhibition of Modern and Decorative and Industrial Arts in Paris in 1925, the sort of same forms again, constantly being repeated over and over. This very strong geometry. This is the garden here below. That's the, this was a moving ball with mirrors on it that would actually reflect the light around the area. And then of course we have, again by Gabriel Gulbenkian, the Villa Noyels in the Côte d'Azur, the sort of same features and geometry again. But I thought this was interesting. We're even finding it in porcelain pottery, and this is a Limoges vase of the same period. So the design pattern is completed and followed over and over again. And Jellicoe picked this up, whether it was intentional or not. Well, I suspect it was his subconscious that found those patterns. This is looking the other way towards the main entrance and the pump house and security guard. And you can see these sort of small viewing platforms. This is the routeway that the workers would come to from the train station, small seating areas off to the side. And you can see that there's actually, the water's low, very, very little change in level. The same detail was repeated at Hemel Hempstead in terms of these viewing platforms, along with the weirs that he developed. Now, you get up to the top, the planting's gone, the train station is here, and this is actually the source of water, which when you get there, is really quite disappointing because it's just so exposed. The illusion, the secrecy is gone by the exposure of loss of planting. Perfectly competent in terms of the drawings, are very useful for any restoration work to have these, but we have no planting plan, and it was normally Susan Jellicoe, his wife, that did the planting. We haven't discovered one yet. Again, a detail, such low-lying land, flat land, very little change in level. How do you actually make the water work and make it look interesting? And what he developed was a series of small concrete weirs, which were like corrugated cardboard. And the idea of this, it would appear to increase the amount of water going over and catch more light. We actually find the same detail again at Hemel Hempstead. Condition, appalling, but it gets worse as we start to look at things. And when we see in 2020, the factory is gone, you can just picture the edge of the water canal and features. And Jellicoe did refer to this as the equivalent to an 18th century moat, where people couldn't jump across, but in this case, it was shallow enough for children to paddle in. And then this, just a couple of weeks ago, the new housing. And this is where we get into some issues about, I think, our listed landscapes. This is a grade 2 landscape. And I think it's more of a degraded grade 2 landscape with the housing that comes up here. Cheshire Gardens Trust was consulted briefly, very late on, about this. And we did make the comment in terms of the listing that this land over to the face of the factories should have been part of the listing. It's not. It was only up to about here is the listed area. And I have to point the finger to historic England. I think they made a serious error of judgment on this. I think it has destroyed the integrity of this design. Annabelle Downs, when I sent her the photograph of the housing, replied, "Yikes, how hideous and puny housing." I think it makes it all the more worthwhile talking about it, doesn't it? And the context and all that. Public open space, I have this area designated as, I'm sure it'll be fenced off like that too. Stop kids from drowning in it. And I think Annabelle's absolutely right. It is really hideous. But what gets even worse, I think, is when you see this and you see, maybe they came across Jellicoe's book on Italian gardens. So we'll have something like an Italian cypress that we'll put in here. But to do this, to call it Jellicoe Gardens, to me is an absolute insult. This is where I say we won the battle, but we lost the war. And this, a few years ago, was an overgrown, wildlife-rich habitat, which quite frankly, and you can see the planting in there still, I would have preferred to have kept it that way than even to try and restore it. Dominic Cole, I sent him some information and we had a little discussion about this. I have long tried to argue for registered gardens to have statutory status, but I'm banging my head against a brick wall. I've been working with National Trust on the response to HS2 since 2012, where the line affects National Trust properties. The impact statements drawn up by HS2 from various consultants are box ticking exercises done by young desk-based computer nerds who do not actually visit the site. I spent hours explaining the significance of these sites to various board stairs. So I think it's a very sad situation. What's so special? Well, first of all, what's special to me, I met Jellicoe when I was a student, probably around 1970. And I'll be very honest, this funny little Englishman in clothes that looked like my grandfather would wear, I didn't appreciate it. Come to sort of understand and appreciate him far more as I got older. My interests then were with the sort of Californian landscape architects such as Tommy Church and Larry Halprin and Garrett Ecklow, those sort of people. But special now to me is quite different. It actually embodies so many important aspects of Jellicoe's work as a rare postmodernist landscape. And it's designed by one of the most respected landscape architects of the 20th century. And not just in this country, but internationally. It's also, I think, important, really important, because it was an early experimentation with his use of water, illusion, and perspective that actually formed the basis for a lot of his later ideas. And I will stop there and we'll go on to Rob's. Annabelle?
Well, thanks so much, Ed. That was fantastic. We'll hope we have a whole bunch of questions for you afterwards. So I'd like to introduce Rob Belcher now. He's currently Birkenhead Park, General Manager, and with his team is seeking to realise the full potential of the park in benefiting its local communities while recognising and conserving its special historic significance. So Rob comes from a background in planning and landscape design. He's a green flag judge, and in recent years has managed the restoration of a couple of Thomas Mawson public parks in the Potteries. So over to you, Rob.
Oops, sorry. That's my fault. Too many buttons.
Okay.
Oh, hello.
Okay,
yeah,
thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah, a little bit louder if you can.
Okay, okay. Thanks very much. Try not to sabotage me, Ed. You're in control. Thanks very much. Thanks for the introduction, Annabelle. Hello, I'm Rob, and as Annabelle said, I'm General Manager of Birkenhead Park, only since the beginning of this year. Annabelle invited me to be Ed's wingman for this evening's presentation and to use my 10-minute slot to briefly talk about the park I work in. I hope I live up to your expectations, Annabelle. Given the title of this series of talks, you might be wondering what Birkenhead Park has got to do with iconic post-war designed and listed landscapes and gardens. I was a bit, and never mind actually the landscape of the Cadbury Factory. There are some obvious connections. Well, one, Birkenhead Park is certainly an iconic landscape, and it's listed at grade 1, no less. It's one of only a handful of public parks outside London to be so listed. And obviously, as Ed has said, it's geographically, it's on the Wirral Peninsula and only 3.5 miles away from the Moreton Cadbury Factory. And it struck me as well, and I noticed, I think it was Alan put a message in the chat. The other similarity is the two landscape designers of these two sites also had something in common in complaining about the sites that they were presented with. So thanks for that, Alan. But I think there are perhaps one or two other threads which may connect these two sites, and I'll offer a few thoughts over the next few minutes for your reflection. First, if you're not aware of the place, here's some facts and figures. So the Birkenhead Town Commissioners of the mid-1800s saw the need for a public park as an essential element of the wider plan to expand the town. It's a pretty visionary approach, and it needed special powers from Parliament to create a park at the time. Your man Joseph Paxton was called on to design the park and oversee its construction, and he was assisted by Edward Kemp. It received its first visitors in 1845, and then a couple of years later, in 1847, it was formally opened. And as such, it was one of the first public parks created by a municipal authority anywhere. We like to think of it as being the first, but we won't go into that now. The quality of its design, along with the social and political concepts that it embodies, influenced the creation of urban public parks across the world, and most notably Central Park in New York, designed by Olmsted and Box. Olmsted visited Birkenhead Park in 1850, only a few years old, and even then he was extremely impressed, and that he took that with him back across the pond. Today, the park is 138 acres in size. It's quite large for a municipal park outside of the city. It's in 3 sections. They're separated by public roads. It's 2 lakes, 8 lodges of various designs, a 2.5 mile long carriage drive, 2 cricket clubs and a rugby club. Gives you an idea of the size. And it welcomes about 2 million visitors each year. Next slide, if you would, Ed. I'm sure it's coming up. Thank you very much. So this is Paxton's 1844 plan. You might have seen the smaller version of it on one of Ed's slides earlier. It includes a 110-acre irregularly shaped park. It's bounded by the wiggly carriage drive that you can see there. And it's within a generally straight-sided site with about 90 acres of plots for house building, filling the land in between. And that's what Paxton designed. The design centres on creating a feeling of countryside in the town, rus in urbe, as the Latin goes. Paxton was an exponent, as I'm sure you know, of the English landscape school, and he brought this to bear at Birkenhead Park, using all sorts of the clever and subtle design devices to achieve that. It was a design that was intended to impact on the emotions of all its visitors, and this was the political aspect of it, the social political aspect of it, I suppose. That it was a park available for all. It's really difficult for us to get a handle of that today, having grown up with public parks, but this was a park created by a municipal authority for everybody equally. Olmsted made the point when he visited that it was their for the poorest of the poor, right up to the Queen herself. So what are the connections back to what Ed was talking about? Whilst Ed and I had a brief chat a week or so back, the words context, authenticity and integrity occurred to me, and Ed's already used a couple of those. So these are concepts that we at Birkenhead Park have been grappling with over the last couple of years, particularly to help us better understand the significance of our heritage, and therefore how we can be managing and protecting it better. I think UNESCO's World Heritage operational guidelines recognise the importance of authenticity and integrity, particularly in thinking about heritage significance, and provide useful definitions which we've tried to take on board. So essentially, authenticity relates to truthfulness and credibility. How real is it? And integrity is about wholeness. How complete and intact is it? When we think at Birkenhead Park, that it scores pretty well on both these counts. The park itself is an authentic realisation of Paxton's vision, and the original layout and associated features remain largely intact. Of course, over the years, there have been many instances of unsympathetic interventions, but these are relatively few, and where they exist, they're generally retrievable. Interestingly, the areas wholly realised are the periphery housing blocks. In other words, those bits of land, thanks Ed, those bits of land between the wiggly road and the straight bits. And it's particularly along the north and east boundaries, which on this one, the other way around, because it's turned upside down. Well, it's not, the map's not turned upside down, but for some reason Paxton drew this the opposite way around that we might normally do these things. So it's over on the left where, and all the way along the bottom. So that they weren't realised to a large extent. And most of those plots, about 30 acres, subsequently became additional areas of parkland, and that's what they are today. However, the impact on this, I suppose, incompleteness of the original design intentions is visible in some elements, and particularly so in certain ones. A good example, I think, is the impressive bulk of the three-arched grand entrance, which you might notice behind me, which stands alone at the northeast, or on this case, bottom left corner of the park, rather than having the large villas immediately alongside it to complete the picture intended. You can see, well, you might be able to see if you're looking closely there, you can see that Paxton has got this idea of the houses alongside. They're not there. On the bottom line to the right is bowling greens, and then to the north it's all open grassland. So it does tend to stand out a bit like a sore thumb, and it's a bit difficult for people to fathom out sometimes because the scale doesn't look right. I was quite interested in Ed's talk about the Cadbury Factory, you know, and the interplay between the factory and the landscape, and the factory's gone. In this case, unlike the factory disappearing, the elements weren't demolished, they just never were built in the first place. And it sort of starts to spring to mind, I don't really know the answer to this. Does it lessen the integrity of the design as it appears today, would you say? Next slide, please, Ed. So anyway, Birkenhead Park has experienced much change over its 175 years, as you'd expect, usually in response to external pressures. Some positive, some not so. In many ways, that's the dynamic nature of a public park, being able to adapt to societal changes. Things have appeared and disappeared over the years, including a conservatory, 2 bandstands, various kiosks, bomb shelters during the Second World War, as well as allotment gardens, tennis courts, play areas, and numerous trees felled and planted over those years. Some have been responsive to its value as a special heritage asset, and some haven't. But they come and go, The majority of these interventions have been done with the best intentions, of course, though sometimes they've perhaps been misguided, resulting in insensitive improvements. I mean, one thing that I'm very aware of at the minute and when we're looking at is planting trees has got to be a good thing, hasn't it? But in a historic landscape that has been carefully designed to hide and reveal features, to frame views and vistas and to form a diverse structural canvas with alongside other species to complement scale, colour, texture, etc., etc. It must be carefully managed. Otherwise, the very element which is integral to the place's heritage significance will slowly erode and eventually disappear. And in many ways, managing an ever-changing soft landscape, I think, can be so much more difficult than buildings and structures, which generally don't tend to move around and get bigger all by themselves. But our tree stock does, and we need a strong tree strategy for that. Throughout its life, the park has had its ups and downs, and it's provided for local people's needs at times of crisis, most notably during the 2 World Wars and indeed more recently too, of course. In the 70s and 80s, it was a time of severe challenge for the UK's public parks generally. Birkenhead Park wasn't immune from the impact of reduced public funding, fragmentation of managerial responsibilities, increasing neglect and vandalism, and a disengaged local community, amongst other symptoms. The spiral of decline of many parks in the 1980s. Some have described Birkenhead Park as a no-go area during that time. I've seen photographs, and it's certainly not a pleasant place to look at. However, in 1997, which marked the 150th anniversary of its formal opening, plans were developed for a project that would start to restore the park to its former glory. And in 2002, a big funding cocktail of nearly £12 million was assembled to undertake a major improvement scheme. And that investment has undoubtedly resulted in revitalising the park and opened a new chapter in terms of where we are and where we want to be. Since that restoration programme was completed in 2007, the park and its stakeholders have had time to catch our breath and to stabilise. And all told, we're in a reasonably decent position at the moment. But now it's time to kick on to the next part of the journey. Of course, there are many continuing challenges, not least of which is the perennial issue of funding, along with staff capacity and expertise. Next slide, please, Ed. So how do we ensure that the park doesn't once again fall into neglect, that its value as a significant asset is recognised, and that it's not vulnerable to being swept away or insensitively improved? Actually, I think as a park manager, in theory, it's relatively straightforward. At the centre, it has to be, well, it has been since its inception, actually, as a park designed by the people for the people. It's to ensure that the park continues to build and maintain value to its communities. That means fully engaging with them and understanding their needs. Now, some significant parts of our local communities where daily life is a real struggle for people on a number of fronts. So for us, it's about being people focused. If the park's highly valued by local people and it's an integral part of neighbouring communities, there'll be greater political support for it, and everything flows from that. That's the approach for us, is that it's an integral part, as it always was intended to be, of the local community. So community and park is, in a sense, it's blurred. Yes, we've got defined physical boundaries, but actually the feeling of ownership by the community of the park is essential. Our vision is primarily to realise the park's full potential, improving the quality of life and health of those who live and work locally, identifying what we can do, working alongside other organisations to achieve positive impacts for health, social well-being and wider environmental issues. And all that must be achieved within the context of the park's special historic significance, which means that We need to make sure that everyone with an interest in the park understands what that specialness is and what it means. That goes for our communities and visitors, but also the whole gamut of stakeholders, and specifically those who are directly responsible for its management and protection. In recent times, the pandemic has shown us how crucial public parks are for people's health and well-being. We aim to build on that, and in other spheres too. Parks are vital in environmental terms, of course, and we can make important contributions directly and indirectly to climate emergency mitigation, as well as improving species diversity. Final slide, please, Ed. Thanks very much. So, yeah, future World Heritage Site, question mark. So amongst all this, there's a small issue of seeking World Heritage Site recognition. I know that might sound a bit of an audacious ambition, but so was that of the town commissioners in creating the park in the first place. If successful, we don't see it as an end in itself, but rather a part of the overall plan for Birkenhead Park, helping to increase understanding and awareness of its significance and importance, while strengthening its future management and protection. The idea has been simmering for a number of years, but really started to come to the boil in 2017 as a result of encouragement from a number of sources. With now a stronger understanding of what we have in Birkenhead Park and that its international value should be appropriately celebrated and protected. Our focus is now to get on to the UK's tentative list of World Heritage Sites. So we're waiting for government to review the current list. In the meantime, we've been preparing for that with the support of a valued group of experts, including David Jakes, which Ed, you referenced earlier. We've prepared a preliminary nomination document structured to UNESCO's operational guidelines, and we've been sharing our ambition widely and building a network of critical friends, mentors and partners. It's an exciting and challenging journey for us in Birkenhead. And next year is the 175th anniversary of the park's formal opening. We plan to celebrate it with a varied programme of events and activities throughout 2022. Fingers crossed and all that. And that will be both in the park and online. Just to finish off, we'd love to invite you to join us to celebrate. And if you're able, please come and visit. It'd be lovely to see you. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Ed and Rob, for that extraordinary story. It takes a lot to shut me up, but I'm with Virginia's comment there. I'm shocked, rigid by what's happened to the Jellicoe landscape, but so relieved that Rob's there at Birkenhead to take it forward. I wondered if, I think there have been some very interesting parallels between these two extraordinarily different sites, but things like social requirements, political implications. And I wondered if I could ask Karen and Annabelle to both unmute. I was particularly taken by, I think we've got a series, Paternalism to Armour-Plated Serpents to Ping Pong. And starting, I remember Helena Chance's lecture on Bourneville and the move from a landscape that became far more paternalistic and about possibly social engineering. I wondered if the pair of you could perhaps thrash it out between you or debate the sort of things that you said about relevance to the two sites and perhaps address, Ed and Rob could address those parallels of why we produce landscape for chocolate workers and for the industrial people of around Birkenhead. Is that too open-ended a question? Are you there, Karen?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, fine.
I have a little bit of a problem. I've had a beer.
Shall we pass swiftly on to Annabelle and see if she's sober?
So Annabelle, you shoot and I'll join in.
Well, Well, I suppose the thing I wondered about was, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to answer any of your questions, Helen, was whether
Nothing new there.
the local community was the answer for Moreton, you know, and whether, okay, so it's lost that, you know, the space and the context and things, but whether there's something, you know, positive that could happen with the local people.
It's quite interesting because Rob and I had a discussion the other day when I mentioned the idea of Jellicoe Gardens, which I just thought was a total insult to
Yes.
Jellicoe.
Yeah.
And he said something similar had happened at Birkenhead, where a developer had proposed sort of, I guess, an entrance or a small short road being named Paxton Way or something similar. And it was the local friends of Birkenhead Park, if I recall Rob correctly, that actually sort of rose up and sort of made their voices heard. I mean, one of the problems we have is that something like a name of a place simply goes on to an application form. Nobody even notices it. And in terms of Moreton, they're not going to know who Jellicoe is. They'll have no earthly idea in terms of the local officers or the planning department. And so it just goes through, you know, on and on. And it's just another, well, it's that tick box that Dominic referred to of the desk, you know, CAD jockeys and those sort of people. So I'm not sure that Moreton will be able to get the people together. I think it needs almost something on a broader base, you know, almost like the Garden Trust and a more national approach, because I don't think you'll get the people together on that local community about the name of a place or about preserving it. And I do point the finger at historic England once again in terms of the way they listed the site, but also we have issues with planning departments in terms of lack of conservation officers, and also the lack of education of conservation officers in terms of landscape issues. There's a big hole there.
So is the, sorry to interrupt, so is the answer then the bulldozer? Just get the bulldozer in and fill it up with soil?
Well, I do wonder, I mean, have we just wasted our time? I mean, I know the research, I know the basis of the listing for Moreton was basically the research I had done in a paper I had written. And I feel so disheartened. I wonder, should it just be something that's left on paper and in articles and photographs and we just bury it? I think because what's left is so bad. That's controversial, I hope.
It certainly is. Rob, do you think you should bury Birkenhead if things go terribly wrong? But I mean, it is interesting about landscape development and changing circumstances. I mean, Birkenhead, you've obviously got an enormous community there. Are they pulling with you, pulling against you? Have you got diversity and different views? And how do you handle ownership and heritage, which are two important words that have been mentioned, at something at a completely different scale? Do you, I mean, this whole tree planting thing, do you wreck the entire landscape just to plant more trees for carbon sequestering? I mean, I'm probably being intentionally alarmist, but I'd be interested in your views.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, no, I don't think it should be bulldozed and filled in. I think we need to be responsible and adapt to what's happened to there. We're not going to do any good by doing that. I think once the community grows, maybe they will take a sense of ownership over it, but I think they won't have the same nuanced understanding that we have of the place. I mean, I'm with you, Ed, all the way in terms of the planning system and the listing. I hadn't appreciated how narrow the listing boundary was on it. And it comes back to that thing about the planners and not understanding it and what landscape condition was put on this. What is Bellway Homes' obligation now in terms of looking after what they've inherited and what they have to do to it? And have they applied to put in a silly little bow top fencing around it to stop kids from drowning, which would be horrible. You know, kids would love that. They'd love to jump in. It'd be fantastic. So do we have any knowledge about what Bellway's obligations are?
As much as I hate to say it, I don't know, Karen. I haven't chased that one. I said I have just felt so disheartened completely by the whole thing.
I totally get that, because Broadwater Park is hitting the buffers as well. But I think Cadbury's in particular, I think it's such an important site, and I think it's a good one to have a campaign on, don't you think, Annabelle? Quite a good push and a cause celeb. If we can't look after that, what the hell can we look after? It's utterly ridiculous.
Yes, but I mean, I don't think that the local community are without hope. I think there's no reason why they couldn't be informed, or that there could be. I can remember, at Shepherd Epstein, they produced booklets when they built a new bit of public housing. They produced a booklet for people, new tenants, to say where the doctors were, where the local bus stop was, where it went to, how to look after and maintain their flat. So, it was like a whole little comprehensive thing, so that they felt they were going somewhere where they would be familiar with. And I think, something maybe similar could happen here at Moreton.
Annabelle, can I just ask Virginia, are you there, whether you want to join the debate? There are a number of comments from you about what a wonderful resource it should have been, involving the Cheshire Gardens Trust. Are you willing to join us?
It's the same old story, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm afraid. I feel deeply embarrassed to have worked for Historic England in its previous incarnation. It's a skeleton that they've got now, and everybody has to do everything: buildings, monuments, gardens, the lot, and specialism has really gone out of the window. I don't know. There are some amazing examples in London of where local communities have really got their hands dirty and, really got to grips with this. But I think they need knowledge.
Yes.
They don't know what they've got.
Mm.
They need a gang of enthusiasts to tell them and explain. And they're not stupid. They will take inspiration if it's on offer. I think the problem with the Jellicoe site is its technical handling. I think that is a problem. It needs quite a lot of money spending on it. And its character, I think, is not immediately understandable. I think you do need people who know what they're talking about to talk to the new people. But hey, do it.
Hey, I agree with Virginia there totally. When we did compiling the record and we had all the sites added, I went around to Brunel and I was at Churchill Gardens, and the residents, I was just doing some Vox Pop interviewing and stuff, and they were utterly thrilled. They didn't know what it meant, but they were really proud of the fact that their site had been added to the register.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You're right. You come across this time and time again. When you explain what it's all about, the scales fall from their eyes. And if it's going to be called Jellicoe Gardens, well, at least you've got a hook to hang it on.
Yes.
Well, of course, we've got Jellicoe Square, I think, happening down at King's Cross as well, haven't we, Annabelle?
Yes.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Virginia. Marion, are you there as well? Because there's some interesting comments from yourself. Are you willing to unmute and join the debate?
Hello. Yes, I'm not sure I've got anything more to add. It just made me revisit what we'd written about it, and very much thanks to Ed for all his research and help with that. And obviously it is sad, but there's no point hand-wringing about it. I wonder whether starting a horticultural group at the Jellicoe Gardens might be a way of working their way in, because there was a horticultural group in the factory, so that might be a link to the past that people might feel they can get involved with.
That's a very interesting comment. Yes, again, back to, is it paternalism or is it good management? So, Rob, are there any parallels that you feel are useful to draw with managing Birkenhead? As I said, your situation is very, very different.
It is. But as I said, in the 70s and 80s, the park was really in a bad way, and you know, and strangely enough, very similar with Central Park in New York at the time.
Yeah.
Who would have thought that today?
Mm.
You know, and it's incredible change. But in terms of Birkenhead Park, again, I wasn't around at that time, but I know that was led by the setting up of a friends group, which still goes strong today. And really, that friends group started from the it was a friends group that really recognised, like has been said, really, that as a starting point, recognised the significance of the place as, yes, as a public park which served the people or should be serving the people in the surrounding communities, but also that it had this incredibly special historic significance as well, and they got that, and they used that with in terms of building community support. And I just found when I arrived at Birkenhead Park 3 years ago, and you nattered to local people walking their dogs or whatever in the park, it always amazed me that everybody would say, when they realise you're outsider, which is a little bit obvious because I haven't got any sort of Scouse accent whatsoever, that this is the world's first park, you know. And the next thing that they would know is that it's got some sort of, it was the main inspiration for Central Park in New York. They many times they didn't know any more than that. That's all they knew. But they were, but the local communities are extremely proud of that. Okay, that doesn't always link across to when they want something. Let's put a statue or whatever it might be. Let's make this intervention, and it's got to go there. Yeah, the nuancing of it doesn't necessarily work all the way through all the time, but they're proud because of the heritage of the place. But that's grown. You know, it's easy for me to say public parks are valuable to local communities even more so today and over the last 18 months. So, you know, we get it now. If we didn't get it before, if it was a bit sort of natural to us to go to parks before, but we didn't really get what was so good about it, we definitely get it today, I think. So inherently, public parks have a value as long as they're providing for the needs of local people. So we're already halfway down the track there, if more than halfway down the track, to introduce on top of that these are special design landscapes with a really special heritage is not so difficult after that. So, but I still think you know, the key to somehow saving special places, special landscapes, is to have the support, the community support of ordinary people that live and work in the area, and that, yes, they clearly need to have some understanding of the importance of the place, but it is more difficult with some locations than others, and parks are quite easy because we've got a ready audience, really.
Rob, can I interrupt? Sorry, Helen. How big is the Friends group? How many people?
Oh,
roughly.
Well, of course, you've always got a membership group, which is quite big, and then, as you know, with any group, then you've got a smaller group of people who actually do things. But
yeah,
I mean, in terms of membership, it'll be well over 3 figures. In terms of those that you see along, probably 30s, 40s, something like that.
Okay, yeah.
But, and on a number of fronts, and we're looking to we work very well with the Friends group, you know, in terms of management, they're fully involved and engaged, and work with us on inspections and management plans and stuff like this. But we've got a mixed bunch of people that are happy to come in and litter pick. Some people will come in at any time and they'll come and ask for a litter picker and a bag. And then we've got very academic supporters as well, who have been tremendous in our preparation of the preliminary nomination document for World Heritage Site status. So we're extremely lucky to have that diverse community on our doorstep.
And of course, I expect the Garden Trust to support the application for the UNESCO bid.
very
Where thank you, Rob. Where I hadn't realized, Rob informed me some time ago, there are no public parks on the UNESCO World Heritage Site list, which is quite extraordinary.
And the nearest one to getting it is Central Park, New York, who are on the tentative list in the US, and we're talking together about how we support each other as well through that.
There was another area, sorry, Karen, that strikes me, that this funny area at the end of the Wirral, which I'm sure most people have never been to, but there's not only the Moreton site and Birkenhead Park, but there's Port Sunlight. And there's Thornton Manor as well, which is related to Port Sunlight in terms of Lord Leverhulme. So there's this group value, although not next to each other, not in the same town, but there's this group value of these extraordinarily important sites, you know, all very close together. And so to me, there's a package there somehow to explore and exploit.
Well, thank you very much. That's got the Cheshire Gardens Trust busy for the next few years, hasn't it?
Oh, yes. I keep trying to retire.
Can I say something, please? Two things, actually. Just in terms of volunteers, I'd just like to let you all know how lucky we are in this country that we can have volunteers, because in August, I was in the National Botanic Gardens Wicklow site with the head gardener there, who's a friend of mine, and I was flabbergasted to find out that they are not allowed to use any volunteer labour participation whatsoever because of Office of Public Work union things, which I was just horrified, and it just, you know, ties our hands totally. So at least we're doing really, really well here for that. But in terms of what we can do about all this and getting communities involved, I don't disagree. I think that's absolutely fundamental. But looking at the steps before that, we've talked about this before, but we need to get our own profession to understand about these sites. Now, I do not know if Bellway Homes have commissioned a landscape architectural practice to work with them on this, but if they did, they should know what they're dealing with. And so often they don't. And I know we had that at Hansa Civic Centre, the practice involved had no idea that it was a Jacobson landscape. And that story goes around, you know, lots of places. So that's another front that we need to push regarding this.
Thanks, Karen. I'm going to stop you there because we're running out of time. Thank you to Alan Tate for that quote, which was wonderful. I think we probably, is Greenwich Park not included in Maritime Greenwich World Heritage Site? From Alan, quick one-line answer, please, from somebody. If you do have an answer.
I can say that there are public parks within the boundaries of World Heritage Sites as they exist. Saltaire is another one, but there are no World Heritage Sites that are is purely a public park.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Annabelle, can I pass back to you, please?
Yes.
Before we all die of starvation.
Brilliant. Yes. No, thank you very much. Gosh, fantastic. Thanks so much. Well, I think we're going to need both Rob and Ed back on the scene with friends and knowledge and helpers and things to be positive about Moreton and get something done. So, but while I leave that thought with you, I would like to thank you both very much for all that you've brought to this discussion, all your thoughts and ideas and information about the design and everything, and drawing the comparison with Birkenhead, which I thought was really interesting, really fantastic, very much appreciated, and look forward to seeing you again shortly.